So let me share with you where we're going to go. We're going to start with just some insights from us and others about why rising leaders stumble at every step of the way. What's going on? We're going to share research with you about what our research shows around what's required to step from being effective at one level to get to be effective at the next level. And we'll share what exactly that formula is. And then I'm going to share a case study of a leader that I've worked with that was making the transition from that middle to executive level. And I'll tell you her story. It's actually it's a pretty cool story, and she was a total delight to work with. So also fun to share for that reason. All right. So I think one of the things is every time a new generation comes into the workplace, the expectations in the workplace change dramatically. And a 2015 study of millennials, Gen Ys, when they were all coming in and taking on leadership roles, there was a lot of talk about the expectation for how quickly this generation expected to be promoted relative to Gen X. There was also, for those of us who are old enough to know, where there was a group of us as baby boomers who were frustrated with how fast the Gen X's. And then the silent generation was really frustrated with the baby boomers. So that continues. And more recently, looking at a study of Gen Z who are entering the workforce in large numbers now, 76% of Gen Z expect to be promoted within 12 months. So even just in the 4 years in one generation, that's quite close to each other. The expectations for how quickly I will be promoted are moving fast. Wouldn't be such a big deal if organizations were doing a great job preparing people for these transitions. But for those of you who have been in the work for a long time, you may have noticed that the training that was standard across organizations in the 60s, 70s, and 80s has really diminished significantly. And so what we find now is, looking at a whole variety of studies, many managers are feeling unprepared. There's a study from Gartner that shares with us that managers don't feel equipped to develop their direct reports. There's a study that shows that most middle managers feel like they haven't received enough training to do their job successfully. Many employees and managers feel like they're on the job training is subpar, and many managers will say that, I may have gotten some training, but there are a whole host of them who are saying they got no training at all. Another thing I will share with you, we're part of many organizations' efforts to train leaders in groups. And one of the things that happened, it started happening in the 90s and has grown since then, is the shift between management and leadership. For those of you who've been around, you may remember in the 80s, it started the conversation, what's the difference between management and leadership? That became a bigger topic in the 90s. And what has happened over, in particular, the last 20 years is there is less and less management training and more leadership training. And so we're finding that leaders, when they get to more senior levels, are missing some of the basic management skills of delivering feedback and delegating and communicating expectations and managing team dynamics, because some organizations are sort of leaping right over that managerial training. So we have a deficit in this space. So if you imagine the deficit is happening at each level of transition, what do we end up seeing by the time we've got executives? So we know many senior executives fail within the first 18 months. Now, failure can be, is broadly defined in this study, from not meeting expectations, but still maintaining their jobs, to being either quitting or being let go. So there are many reasons. And those of you who are coaching at that transition level or at the senior level, I'm sure have seen many of these. So as I just said, one of the foundations of this is they're missing those basic management skills. They didn't get that training. And so now they're up in a much higher stakes, more complex role, and they are missing some of the key basics. In some cases, again, because the training is remiss, and we also know that many performance systems are not giving really good feedback, and many organizational cultures don't have great feedback cultures. So we also see sort of this flow up into the senior level of people who were never very good leaders, and they're just sort of pushed up the organizational chain. We also see that people aren't aware of all the complexities in these transitions. And certainly by the time you get to the senior level, that if they're using things that were their middle management strategies, or in some cases, we even see people who are using strategies that are more appropriate at that more first line management level, then they're not going to be successful at the senior leader level because it requires a very different approach to leadership. We see a lot of leaders, again, because they haven't been stepped up through the process of evolution of leadership, that the expanded scope and scale becomes overwhelming for them. Also, the ability to navigate the politics and the broader mix of stakeholders. And I'll share more about that in a little bit. We also see the inability to understand and or use their power wisely. So we see people who underuse their power, right? People are frustrated with them because they're not stepping up and leading the charge for important changes. They aren't speaking up. They aren't doing what they need to do to create a more constructive culture. So they're not using their power. And then we have some people who are swinging the other way, of course, and are seeing themselves as the supreme power in the organization and being very unconstructive in some cases, really be overusing a sense of power in a destructive way. One of the things that happens when people get in particular to these different levels, and I think even more so at the executive level, is they want to prove themselves right away, right? I deserve this role. This was a smart either promotion or hire. And so they want to hit the ground running, and they don't take the time to really do a listening tour, to build in receiving feedback from others, from really taking time to learn where they've landed. And as a result, we see lower self-awareness as they go into that space. They don't understand how they're perceived because they're not asking for feedback, not paying attention. And we also see that they have a distorted perception of culture. Just as an aside, we have a leadership culture assessment. And oftentimes when we do that in organizations, we will break out the different layers in the organization and look at the perception of leadership culture based on where you are in the organization. And most often, the biggest outlier is the senior leadership team. They're so insulated. They have a distorted view of what the actual culture and leadership culture is in the organization. So, of course, there are many, many reasons that once somebody gets to the executive level, they aren't able to either sustain or be effective. These are some of the most common that we see. So let's lift up the good news. Right, this is our work. We're coaches, and while I think group development plays an important role in the evolution of managerial and leadership skill development, really change happens, development happens at a fundamentally individual level. And we think that coaching is instrumental in actually helping people do the navigation of these big transitions. I think from our perspective, we don't just start with a blank slate. We have a lot of research that helps us figure out where an individual is at a given point in time and how we can help them get to the next level, sort of our rubric. So staying in your individual role and moving to the next level are sort of two challenges, right? How do I stay effective in my role? But the bigger leap is, how do I move to this next place and be effective? Sort of, there's great opportunity in it, right? Because it is, in one way, a chance to start anew and be very intentional. In another way, it's fraught for a lot of people with challenge and anxiety. How do I know I can be successful? It's a new set of stakeholders. How long will it take me to have a level of mastery and competence? Who are the new people I'm going to be engaged with, and how will I understand their expectations? So, how do we help? So I think the first thing is it's really for us as coaches to be as informed as we can about what it takes to move from one level to another. And of course, all the good coaching skills and insights that we bring in understanding the culture, understanding the stakeholders, understanding the individual. At MRG, we take a research and assessment informed approach to coaching. We've been around, as Lucy said, for 40 years. We have a lot of data. We use that data to inform our thinking through our research. We have our own assessments, and we really find that having these two sources of data along with good coaching practices yields really great results for the individual and for the organization. So I'm going to first share with you the research that we use when we're working with leaders in transition. We just recently redid this research. This is brand new, hot off the press. You're the first group to see it. We looked at over 15,000 leaders who have taken our Leadership 360 assessment instrument between the years 2018, remember that those years, those pre-pandemic years, all the way through just a few weeks ago. So about 5.5 years of data. Our leadership assessment is called the LEA 360, and it measures two sets of things. It measures 22 behaviors, and it measures effectiveness through competencies. So the behavior measurement for us is really measuring very specific components of how a leader shows up. And we're not asking, is the behavior good or bad? We're asking, how often do you as a leader feel you're using this behavior? And for observers, how often do you see the individual using the behavior? We also have a set of 32 competencies that we ask the observers. How effective is this person? Ranging in things from how effective are they at making decisions, at delivering results, at developing people, at listening. So a wide range of competencies. And so what we're able to do is look at the leaders who are most effective and understand the behavior patterns that distinguish them from the rest of the population. So we can really get this rubric of behavior patterns that help us understand what the transition can be moving through these roles. So more specifically, drilling down into the study, of the 15,000, we took the top 20% who were rated the highest in overall effectiveness. So across this population, we're looking at the people who are seen by their observers as being most effective. And what we're able to do is look at the behavior patterns vis-a-vis those 22 behaviors and find out the patterns. And we're looked at these different levels: individual contributor, first line manager, middle manager, and senior executive. So we're able to understand, what do highly effective leaders look like in terms of their behavior patterns at each of these levels. Then we can compare them, right? We can compare them and understand what does one have to do in terms of shifting their behaviors from one level to another in order to go from effective at one level to being effective at the next level. So it gives us a map, right? It gives us a little bit of a map, at least to start with. And so when an individual contributor is going to first line manager, of those 22 behaviors, 4 of them need to shift if you want to become an effective first line manager. So I want to just take a minute and talk about what we mean by shift. So lots of times when we think about getting better, we think about doing more, right? Doing more of something, or doing something you were never doing before. But in fact, what we learn in our research is it's not just about doing more. It's about, in some cases, using some behaviors more, but in some cases, using behaviors less. So I think a helpful image to have is, rather than thinking of an on-off switch relative to these behaviors, think of it as a volume knob. And wherever we've indicated a plus sign, it means turn the volume up a little bit, right? Use this behavior a little bit more. And wherever you see a negative sign, it means turn the volume down a little bit. It doesn't mean stop doing it. It means just pull back a little bit so that the balance of behavior is shifted. So in this first shift, what's the major shift we're asking these people to make? Well, if you think about the individual contributor, and we've done a lot of work around high potentials and highly effective people at that individual contributor role, they're a little bit, the profile looks a little bit like a renegade, right? They're very innovative. They're very focused on their own success. They're focused on distinguishing themselves from the pack, if you will. They tend to be willing to challenge authority. So they have this sort of unique, individualistic way of engaging in their work. So all of a sudden they're moving to this first line manager, and now they are in the chain of command. And so a big part of this shift is pull away from that, sort of individual superstar and recognize that you are now part of a managerial system. And you have to pay more attention to that. You also have to pay more attention to the success of others. As an individual contributor, you are highly attentive to your own success. Now your behavior needs to shift to help other people be successful as well. So that's the thematic shift that happens in that level. The next level is, how do I go from first line manager to middle manager? And of the 22 behaviors, here we see quite a big shift. A little less than half have to shift in order to go from first line manager to middle manager. So this is a bigger shift. It's a bigger transition. It requires really a different mindset from that first line manager mindset. Thematically, we can think about it as you've got to take more risks, right? You know, as a first line manager, you're very focused on the tactics of getting the job done. It's more tactical, it's more task oriented. At a middle manager, your scope has broadened, and you've got to be a little bit more risk oriented, and you have to be willing to take on more decision-making responsibility. There's more complexity here. You have to be willing to push down the organizational chain for higher level goals. It's not just the tactics, there are broader level goals you're now responsible for. And you have to release yourself from that tactical execution. This is often a real Achilles heel for people making it to the middle manager. I think the term in the weeds is pretty common, right? You stay too close to the action. You're doing work that other people should be doing. You're overseeing things that you have to trust your first line managers to do. So you have to separate yourself. So it is not only a managerial behavioral shift, it's a mindset shift in this space. And oftentimes that can, without help, it can take a while to really make that fundamental shift and seeing your role in a very different way. And finally, right, the shift from middle to executive leader, you probably could have guessed this. This is the biggest shift in behavior. It is the most complex shift in behavior, and it is the most challenging transition for most leaders, because over half of the 22 behaviors need to shift if you want to mirror the pattern of behaviors that happen at an executive leader, even from being a highly successful middle management leader. And here's one of the mindset shifts, right? If somebody understands that people have seen them as highly effective at the level they're transitioning from, the idea of fundamentally needing to change can be hard to grasp because, listen, I've been really good. So to really, really get that the transition is significant can be challenging for folks. So when what we think of as sort of this kind of transition, right, is actually this kind of transition. And I think both from a coaching perspective and from an organizational perspective, it's easy to think that these transitions are equal in measure, but in fact, they become more and more significantly challenging, and therefore require more time, more assistance, more clarity of expectations to help people be successful. There's a reason that the transition from middle to executive leadership has the highest fail rate in this transition journey organizationally. All right, so I want to just quickly share why that is. What about that senior role can make this so demanding, right? Why? In addition to why is that behavior change so significant? Why do so many behavior changes need to occur? So there again, these senior roles certainly vary, but here are some of the themes that we see across them. Much heavier demands intellectually. There's a lot of conflicting data. There's a lot of, there's no easy answers. If we do it one way, this is going to happen. If we do it another way, this is going to happen. So the brain needs to deal with a lot of cognitive dissonance in this space, a lot of complications, and often with incomplete and or conflicting information. So the cognitive demands tend to be very heavy at this level. Also, you are no longer just in a singular functional area. If you're at the executive level, you're making organization-wide decisions. So oftentimes with trying to process information from other parts of the organization that you don't know as well. The stakes are higher. We're talking organizational level decisions, right? We're talking strategic level decisions that have big stakes, both in human resources and also financial. There's an increased distance between your stakeholders at a senior level, right? You're the executive leadership team, which means your stakeholder to some degree is the full range of the organization. And so your reputation is, people are going to have an idea of your reputation when you have little contact with them, right? And so whether you are thought of well or not is going to happen to some degree in the rumor mill with minimal knowledge, with incomplete knowledge. You also have to influence now this broad range of stakeholders who have different mindsets, different experiences, who are influenced in different ways. So that becomes a challenge. Shifting priorities, as certainly the pandemic has taught us a lot about how organizations can be turned on its ear in a very short period of time. But marketplace dynamics, the economy, regulations, board priorities, all kinds of things happen that move into that executive level that require them to be very, very agile at that senior level. You know, the emperor, empress, royalty without any clothes, right? Much less feedback is received at that executive level. And unless the senior leaders are really active in seeking out feedback, they end up finding themselves in bubbles that leave them unsure of how they're perceived and without really clear feedback around how they're doing. And then finally, of course, at this level, you've got more external pressure, right? Customers, vendors, suppliers, the board, regulators, in many cases, politics. You are no longer insulated into just the organizational context. So there's a lot going on at this level that makes it especially challenging. So let's focus on this tricky transition here. And then we're going to stop for questions. So what happens here is this massive change, a whole set of behaviors that we need to increase and a set of behaviors that we need to pull back on that we have relied on historically. And they're still in play, but just not in play as much. Thematically, let's just look at the top three themes. These people need to stay at the executive level, and this is really, really hard for them because, as we've said, it's very complex there and the brain gets exhausted. And so it's natural to want to sort of slip back into places that are more known and easier. But the work here is to ensure that all work is done at an optimal level in the organization. You're delegating, you're making sure your team is delegating so that the work is done at the appropriate level in the organization. At this level, you are dealing with the most complex goals in the organization. And if the organization is going to achieve at a stretch and ambitious level, it's got to start at the top. And so the focus at the executive level is, are you helping the organization stretch, and are you helping them wisely be open to innovative approaches and taking some amount of risk? And then finally, thematically, that what has to happen at this level is much less about explaining, because when your stakeholders are the entire organization, you can't possibly explain in detail as you might have as a more technical expert or in the middle of the organization. You have got to convince people across the organization in a more compelling way that gets people aligned and often quickly, right? So making that transition from, I'm just going to explain this to you and then you'll come, to I've got to create a persuasive, compelling story that brings you along, again, oftentimes quickly. So it's a lot. It's a lot. And of course, we're not matching everybody up against, this blank slate. We need to be able to really use good assessments to get people to really understand the individual so that we can use the assessment, the research, and our coaching to help them get to the right place, right? That's how we're going to bridge them from one level to the next. So let's take at least one question, Lucy, and I promise I'll be fast on the second half.
We're getting so many great ones, so everyone do keep those coming in. I really love the way you're thinking about this, and we will answer them all afterwards if we don't have time today. But one that came in, someone noticed, Rick noticed less empathy at that executive leader level, and that's really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. That's such a great call out. So remember, it is not, we're not moving empathy down to the low level, right? It's about balance. And what has to happen at the executive level is what's best for the whole organization, right? What keeps us moving? So that's one. I have to be thinking about, so let's just say I've got to downsize one team in order to free up some resources for investment in another place. I have to have sort of the emotional fortitude to do that. So I'm not unempathetic. I just can't be overdriven by my empathy. So it's a softening of it rather than I'm making it low, right? The other thing that happens, and I'm going to talk about this in this case study because it definitely happened with this person I was coaching, is really high empathy can minimize the amount that you delegate. So I'm going to put a pin in that because I'm going to tell you that story through the case study. But when people are really high on empathy or potentially over rely on empathy, oftentimes the distribution of work doesn't happen in an optimal way. So again, when we talk about when a negative sign in front, it doesn't mean the highly effective leaders are low. It means they're rebalancing how much they use that behavior relative to how much they used it at the level before it. So tone it down a little, make sure it's not getting in the way of driving the organization forward, but it doesn't mean let go of your empathy. I hope that, that's a subtle difference. So I hope that made sense.
Thanks. So, we have some cool compassion and empathy research too that we can probably put in the bonus material.
Oh, that's good.
That'll be fun. Amazing, thoughtful questions. Do keep them coming. I am going to let Tricia move on to the case study, but we will answer you afterwards. One other thing I just wanted to mention, if you're not super familiar with the LEA, that's where the research came from in the first half. That's one of the tools that Tricia will be using in the case study. If you want more information just about the LEA specifically and see more of that assessment, get a sample report, just drop LEA in the Q&A box and Kayla and I will make sure you get that information. And again, any questions, any comments, they're so good and juicy. So please keep them coming. Go ahead, Tricia.
I love good and juicy. All right. So I'm going to tell you about Maura. I worked with her and this organization actually, and continued to for quite a long time. She's a chief marketing officer for a healthcare company. She's been at the organization for just under 5 years. She's been in this role for at the time I was started this coaching at 4 months. One of the really interesting things about this case is this was their first chief marketing officer role. It's a nonprofit healthcare provider. It's a decent size, right? 1,000 employees across 3 states. And she was joining the executive team, but they hadn't had a chief marketing officer. They were sort of ambivalent about how much marketing they should do, what roles should marketing play. She was the marketing manager, and but over time, I think strategically, they realized how important it was for the organization. And so they promoted her, and she was the first CMO. for the organization. So that had all kinds of interesting implications, a lot for her mindset and a lot for how she engaged with her peers at this level. So I know this organization reasonably well. It made sense for me to talk to some people with Mara's permission to just get a little bit of a read. And so in my conversations, this is some of the things I heard, right? Mara was very excited about this. It was one of those things, right? Excited coming up to it, and then you get it and you're like, whoo, okay, I'm here and it's big, right? So she was excited, but she was a little bit nervous. Mara's boss really believed in her. She felt really strongly about Mara's values and alignment with the organizational culture. But he also realized this was a big shift, that this was shift for the executive team, shift in a way for him, shift for her and the organization. Her peers knew her from her prior role, but as they were watching her in this transition, they didn't have a very clear read. And you'll see perhaps in her data why some of what was happening for Mara may have been a little bit invisible to them. But they felt like she was in the weeds, that, for example, they might ask, one of their team might ask one of Mara's team for something, and Mara's team would say, well, I got to talk to Mara about that, right? So it seemed like she was a little bit more in the weeds. Her direct reports love her. They just think she is kind and supportive and always there for them, and willing to roll up her sleeves and work right alongside them. So generally positive. And as we'll see in the data, some, revealing some things that we were going to ultimately need to work on. So we don't always do interviews. It made sense to do them now. There are pluses and minuses, I think, to doing interviews. They do provide some texture, and in this case, I did them while people were filling out questionnaires, so it gave me some initial insights. It gave me a read on what these relationships were like for her, and it also, I think, helped people be more invested in this process for her. And I got a little bit of insight into the people that she was working with. I think some of the challenges we have to be mindful of interviews is, of course, they're very subjective, right? It's a very subjective way of gathering data. And they can be, our minds don't often hold a long period of time in the way we think about other people. And we're more likely to give feedback on things that have happened a little bit more recently. Of course, they're time consuming, both for the coach and for in some cases, the interviewees. And as you can see by just looking at some of the, across some of the things she said, you don't always see patterns right away, right? When you're doing the interview, you can pull out some, but you can't pull out as many as sometimes a good assessment will provide. So we are, as I said, research and assessment informed. We like the data to be sort of a foundational piece in our coaching. We talked about, and Lucy highlighted, our LEA 360. As I shared before, it measures 22 behaviors. We really like the behavior framework, developing off behaviors. We certainly use some competency insights to get a read on perceptions of effectiveness. But when it comes to change, behavior is what you're working on. And so to have very accurate measures of behavior help us in the coaching space. We have a unique questionnaire design. For those of you who've never looked at an MRG questionnaire, this is how all of the core of our questionnaires are designed. You have a STEM, and then you have 3 choices. And the choices are equally socially desirable, right? They're neutral. We're not asking, again, for goodness or effectiveness in this part of the questionnaire. We're asking for patterns. And so then we ask people to choose 2 of the 3, and we say, please choose the one that's most like you, and then please choose the one that's next most like you. Further, we ask to tell you how relevant that feels to you. So if make it happen is your first choice and it's a strong first choice, you would circle a 5, or more accurately, click on a 5. And if it's the best of the choices, but not as strong, you do a 4. Same for second choice. Strong second choice is a 3. Best of what's left to me is a 2, right? So it gives us, for those of you who have worked with anchored rating scales and you're trying to explain to your coachee what the difference is between a 3.9 and a 4.1 on a 5-point scale, it can be challenging. And so this gives us a very broad set of highly distinguishable data points that make it easier to go through the data, particularly as you can see when you've got multi-rater data, right? When you've got multiple observers and across a, in this case, a 22-dimension model, it's a lot of data to look at. So just a quick visual, the blue is Mara's scores on herself, the yellow is her boss's scores, the green are her peers, and the purple are her direct reports. And so what we're looking at when I look at this, I am thinking about it in relationship to the research, because for Mara, it was, let's help her make her have this very successful transition. I also look at things like, where are the gaps between Mara's perception of self and others? Every leader you will ever work with has what we call blind spots. Perceptions where they have perceptions of themselves, but their observers don't agree with, right? So I look at that. I look at where there's agreement. So you can see, for example, structuring here and delegation here. And then we explore, right? You give the feedback, you talk about what's working and what's not working, you look at the research, and you build a plan, right? And so for Mara, we ended up with 3 areas. Production, which is how high you set the goals and how focused you are on that. Delegation, how much you're ensuring that you're delegating the work as it should be, so it's happening at the right level. And interestingly, dominant, which is basically how assertive you are. And so production is a big deal at this very senior level, because it sets the tone for the trickle down for the whole organization, right? If you've got a senior team that's more laissez-faire about the goals and more laissez-faire about how they track and measure and pay attention, and are more laissez-faire about how they encourage people in that space, and more laissez-faire about how they get rid of obstacles to achieving stretch goals, then that flow through can happen to the whole organization. So at the senior level, it sets the tone. And so in this space, what she really needed to do was set more ambitious goals. Now you can see her score is way over to the right. She thought she was. And so we, in working through the process, we realized, as often can happen, what was in her mind was not necessarily translating to her, in particular, her team, which is the purple dot here. So there was a number of things she had to do. She had to see the stretch goals as constructive, as something positive. She had to actually sit down and be very specific about what more ambitious goals would be, and distinguish meaningful goals from busy work, because a lot of her team was doing a lot of work, but there wasn't necessarily the right priorities. And in order to get them to buy in, not only to explain the goal rationale, but also to involve the team in setting those goals, to have a mechanism in place, because she was so used to working hand in hand with people, she didn't have a good tracking system. Her tracking system was, I work alongside them, which kept her in the weeds. 2, she's actually quite good at acknowledging good performance, but just as a reminder to do that, and to talk about her own work in where she was stretching and what she was learning about herself in terms of achieving or attempting to achieve stretch goals. And really, they had to do a good amount of work around, how do we get rid of the things that are limiting our ability to do the good work. I told you I mentioned delegation. This happens a lot with highly empathetic leaders. It's so critical at the senior level to make sure that the work is being done at the right level in the organization, and that you are ensuring that you are delegating, and that the leaders who report to you are delegating. But when people are empathetic and and have high standards, which Maura has high standards. This interesting dynamic happens. When people are very empathetic, they tend to know a lot about what's happening in people's lives. And what we find is people saying, they've got so much going on, or they're really already struggling with this project, or I know they've got an ill parent that they're taking care of. And so they don't even go to the delegation place. If they also have high standards, they convince themselves that either they can do it better or faster. And so they might as well just take it on themselves. And so we find that if we're over relying on empathy and not balancing that with what's best for the organization, we end up underutilizing delegation. As you can see here, she was very aware that she was underutilizing delegation. So we did some work in this space. She realized that sometimes she delegated, but people were unclear about what she really wanted. So she would jump in. So we had to make sure she was clear around expectations and clear around what the boundaries were. She would really need to work on specificity. She had to be open to alternative ways of accomplishing tasks, not just the way she would do it. And when direct reports felt like they had too much on their plate, rather than her quickly jumping in to reprioritize, she had to work on saying, come back to me with your recommendations for how you'd reprioritize the work. And then she had to resist the temptation to jump in and rescue the staff by doing it herself. The last one we had to work on was dominant, which it was, being more assertive, essentially, and being willing to push from time to time. She didn't need to work on this with her direct reports. She was in a good place. She felt like she could have the appropriate amount of assertiveness with her direct reports. They would agree, as you can see. She is by nature an assertive person, but getting into this role, she sort of lost her chi a little bit in this space with her peers and her boss. And of course, at the senior level, there are competing priorities. Oftentimes there are, some or all of the individuals are assertive with strong opinions, and you really need to be able to respectfully hold your own in that place. And particularly when you mix a level of assertiveness with persuasion, that can be really powerful in kind of winning hearts and minds and moving people to a certain way of thinking and acting. And so Maura, it was helpful with Maura that she was not a timid person. It was wrapping her head around how she was to participate on this new team and what it meant to be respectfully assertive to the CEO. So part of it was just she was quieter in both one-on-one meetings and group meetings. So speaking up. Repetition is important for assertiveness, right? If you say something, even if you say it with a level of commitment, if as the conversation goes on, you never reinforce your position, then people are assuming you don't hold it very strongly. So repetition was important. We worked with language. She is very collaborative. She is empathetic. So we worked on language that was more definitive. I think we should, rather than, don't you think it might be a good idea if? So more definitive language. We worked on what does it look like to respectfully disagree? I hear what you're saying, but I have a different, lens on this. So that she had entry language into being able to debate and discuss when she disagreed. She has a quieter voice, and so we worked a little bit on vocal tone in this space to help get her point across in a little bit, viscerally a little bit stronger space. And then finally, as she got to know her peers a little bit better, she could be better anticipate this person's going to have this opinion, this person's going to have that opinion. And so she was better able to come into meetings, either anticipating in a one-on-one with the CEO, where he might push back, and she had a way of navigating through that, and the same with her peers. This was really fun work, by the way. So this is our work, right? We move forward then. We've laid out the plan with the coaching. She experiments with things and we have great conversations and a little bit of laughter, right, about what works and doesn't work. Mara did a lot of checking in with observers. I think she did a great job actually for the executive team modeling the courage and the benefit of being open about asking for feedback. And then we worked on, I would just say, for those of you who haven't encountered it, Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy's Immunity to Change was a helpful vehicle in this. It uncovers why it is, if you want to make these changes, you're not making these changes, like what's getting in your way. So we did a little bit of work on barriers to change. And we did keep going back to the assessment loop. We also had a motivational assessment that helped us understand some of her preferences for how she might engage and what happens to her energy in different spots. And that also helped us as well. So it's great. This was a really lovely success story. They're not all as lovely as this, but this one was lovely. She really built a lot of credibility with the CEO and her peers. Her team is working really, really well. And they, as they got used to taking on more, many of them, there was one that didn't work out, but many of them worked out, are really sort of rose to the occasion. She is spending more time with her peers and networking, and also networking externally in the marketplace and being more visible in the marketplace. And she really has established her own reputation, as well as validated the decision to have a CMO in this organization. And now they're just starting to be able to, in some cases, help other teams. They were able to help another team who was working on a customer satisfaction program. And so this kind of internal reputation is trickling down from Mara's development as a leader. So you know this, right? I mean, good work at a senior level really transitions into other work across the organization. And in this particular organization, we've been very involved in everything from the succession planning and executive work. And actually the use of the LEA has drilled down to two levels below that executive team. So it's, good work brings good work. And it's been really lovely. So just a couple of things, just a reminder, and I don't think this is always clear at organizations. I don't think many organizations stop to realize how significantly different each of these roles are in terms of leadership. And so as coaches, I think in part what we do is educate organizations to understand that. And the transition is more complex at each stage of the moving through the organizational space. We love research. We have the corny phrase, research is our middle name, mostly because I'm the corny one in the organization. But individual context is key. So again, for us, the blending of the research with the assessment, with the individual coaching is the magic three, right? In terms of really helping leaders make the fundamental changes. And 360 feedback, and particularly for us, behavior really helps build a map for people. It also, because it's the degree to which you're using the behavior as opposed to you're good or you're bad, we find less resistance in terms of the leaders being open to taking in the feedback and really reflecting on it. And of course, as coaches, development is a career-long, if not a lifelong endeavor. And so we are always checking in. And even, we have a pattern of, even after the coaching is gone, over the formal coaching, just checking in 6 months later, just to see if the sustainability is there. So I know we're getting tight, but we have a couple of minutes, Lucy, do we?
Sure, let's just do one, and then everybody else, if you're still curious about things, drop that right in the Q&A box, because we will follow up afterwards. But one that came in, you talked about doing interview and assessment. Do you do assessment before conducting the interviews and let the assessment guide the interview questions, or what order do you tackle that in?
So it really depends. We don't always do interviews. Here's what is the most common thing for us. We do the assessment first, and then we do what's stakeholder interviews, but we usually do stakeholder interviews with people who couldn't complete the questionnaire. So we will do it with the boss who has completed the questionnaire, and then we do a three-way alignment meeting to make sure we're kind of all on the same page. But for example, if we're doing a senior leader, they might work with external people, or they may work closely with some members of the board, but those people don't see them frequently enough to be able to complete the questionnaire thoroughly. So we might do stakeholder interviews. We add open-ended questions to the assessment to get narrative context from the observers. So we get a lot of narrative information, which serves as a proxy for interviews. So we will occasionally do them when, as we did with Maura, at the beginning, just to get a little bit of lay of the land. She requested that. But mostly when we're doing interviews, we're doing it with the boss and with the stakeholders who are important, who wouldn't have the day-to-day line of sight to the executive or the leader, but we want their input. And again, we always use open-ended questions, so we do get narrative insights as part of our 360 process.